Namo Amida Butsu. Hello, everyone. So the title of today's Dharma talk is Meaningless Meaning. And it comes from a story that Guillaume Kabose Sensei shared some years ago about his wife, who was a Japanese tea master. And she was well known in the Chicago area of teaching the art of tea. And the local reporter had gone to visit her to learn more about this ancient art. So here's what Guillaume Kabose Sensei shared about that experience. A reporter from a local newspaper came to our house to interview my wife about the Japanese tea ceremony. This reporter continually asked, "What is the meaning? What for? Why do you do that? What is the purpose of that?" This kind of question was directed at everything in the making of tea. At every gesture, every implement, without thinking or deliberating, my wife finally replied, "No meaning, meaningless meaning. It is purposeless purpose." End quote. So purposeless purpose, meaningless meaning, what does that mean? Now, when I first read this story, it resonated with me, and I didn't know exactly why. It didn't resonate necessarily at a logical level, but something in the paradox resonated with me. Now, and I love the story of the reporter and Sensei Guillaume's wife, and I can see them really trying to communicate with each other, but somehow talking past each other. Both speaking in English, the teacher of tea and the reporter, yet they were both speaking in different languages. The reporter in the above quote seems to me to trying to understand the art of tea from the perspective of a utilitarian purpose of each act in the art of making tea. In some ways, it would be similar to a reporter asking the dancer, what was the purpose of all those gyrations across the stage when you simply could walk across it? As if the purpose of dancing was simply locomotion from point A to point B, as if the purpose of the tea ceremony was simply to make a cup of tea, which it is, but which it isn't. From a utilitarian perspective, everything must have a purpose, a value. Meaning is only found in utility. I think one of the challenges we have as Americans is that we have a long history of viewing the world in this way. It has become a default mode for many of us, a cultural inheritance, a cultural karma that we carry. And this inheritance has a consequence. I love this from Brook Ziporyn, quote, "The privileging of the idea of purpose creates a mode of relating to the world in which literally by definition, no possible experience can be intrinsically worthwhile. Once we accept the idea that accord with a pre-existing purpose is what makes something count as good, or for what makes things exist, we have condemned ourselves to eternal dissatisfaction." End quote. So something about being Homo Narratus seems that we have to continually create stories. And we create stories to create meaning. And the creating of stories and the creating of meaning is neither necessarily good or bad, but at the same time, it's this privileging of the need for purpose or meaning above other forms of experience that can cause great suffering. We tend to create hierarchies upon hierarchies, degrees and levels of value that have very little to do with what is actually going on in the moment. We are so busy, in fact, of conjuring meanings that the present moment is rarely experienced except through these filters. One Buddhist teacher calls them the bureaucracies of self, layer upon layer that keeps us from actually experiencing our lives. And this bureaucracy of self can be very problematic when our identities, our values as a human being have more to do with what we do than who we are. In the States, when somebody asks you, what do? We don't want to know that you write poetry, you love art, you dance, you travel, you love to be compassionate. We want to know what your job is. What are you employed at? As if though that tells us anything about anyone. It doesn't. Years ago, when my father went from making a lot of money to making very little, I remember seeing him sitting on a couch weeping. I'd never seen my father weep before. Weeping. And I asked him, what was wrong? What's wrong, Dad? Why are you so sad? And it's because I can't make any money. And he said, Dad, that has nothing to do with your value as a human being. And he says, yes, it does. It is direct portion of my value as a man. And trust me, he wasn't destitute. But this is what he saw, that he valued him and gave him meaning. And the lack of his salary diminished his value, diminished his meaning in his experience. Now, many have lost their jobs during this pandemic. And some of you have lost your jobs in the midst of this pandemic. How has that affected your sense of purpose and meaning? In our normal way of living, what tends to give us meaning is that which is outside of ourselves. And that being true, we are always a little ill at ease because everything changes. There is no security in finding our meaning, our purpose outside of ourselves. So what are we to do? Here we are looking to move beyond just past meaning and purpose, because meaning or purpose can be dualistic. They're based on comparison and difference. When we get past this conceptual bind of purpose and meaning, we can start to find the ground of our being. It is through the embrace of meaninglessness, randomness, that we can tap into a spontaneous outflow of living, that we are free to experience simply being alive. And in a real way, and a way of meaning that is through being. And we can find this meaning and this being in the paradox of meaninglessness. Okay, so now I'm confusing myself a little bit, so let's see if I can help. D.T. Suzuki wrote that religion is a way to experience an expansive beingness. Now, for most of us who come from a Judeo-Christian background, the word religion may be the R word. Instead of the F word, it's the R word. But I love this definition that D.T. Suzuki gives us. True religion is a way to experience an expansive beingness. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about an expanded beingness. He goes on to say, quote, It may sound strange to hear that one can live in purposelessness. Everything we do in life has purpose. But in the religious realm, we become conscious of realizing purposelessness, meaningless meaning, and meaning itself. End quote. It can be said that is what meditation is from a Zen perspective. There is no goal in Zazen, in silent meditation. If you have a goal, you are not just sitting. Meditation is teaching us ultimately purposeful purposelessness. That is why it can be so hard to sit. We privilege the idea of purpose above all other things. I find myself constantly, when I'm doing sitting meditation, is repeating to myself, just sit, just sit. There is no goal, there is no purpose beyond being in the present moment, being with my breath, being in the now. By just being, we invite ourselves to get past conceptual meanings, to experience a non-conceptual beingness. It is a way for us to open ourselves up to true being, living in naturalness. I like what Guillaume Cabose Sensei writes when he says, quote, "The flower itself cannot help but bloom as it does. There is no intention. When you love, you love. There's no purpose. Why do we constantly ask for meaning?" End quote. And I think that's a good question, and it's almost a koan, a riddle, something that we can unfold in our reflections as part of our practice. Why do we constantly ask for meaning? Is it an attempt to control our lives, to control this existence? Maybe it's because we privilege this idea of purpose and meaning above other modes of relating to the world. The other is that of the nature of the small ego, the achieving mind, as one teacher puts it. Quote, "Then, as the achieving mind is always trying to achieve something or other, and whenever something is achieved, again the mind asks, now what? What needs to be achieved now?" End quote. And we get stuck in that loop. What next? What next? What next? How many of us have experienced that? He goes on to say that the achieving mind can never be blissful. It always is tense and unsatisfied. I think we also privilege meaning because it keeps the randomness of life at bay. It gives us the illusion of control over our universe. The random act of violence terrifies us, so we create stories of blame, and we blame the victim. If the victim only did X instead of Y, he or she would not have been attacked. They would still be alive. I would have never done Y, and on and on and on. We learn from the Buddha that much of life is random, nature is random, our existence is ultimately random. Uchiyami Roshi calls it accidental. We could just as easily been born anywhere else at any time than when we leave. There was nothing that was said you had to be born when you were born and where you were born. There is nothing that said you had to be here today listening to this Dharma talk. Randomness, accidentalness does not mean that events and people are not interrelated. As Guillaume Cabose Sensei teaches, all things are relative. It just means that we fail to see the interrelatedness in all of life in any meaningful way. We fail to see the meaningless meaning. So we cower in the randomness and make up nice little stories, contrivances, theories, conspiracies, conjectures, formulae, and hierarchies to keep the randomness at bay. But something being meaningless does not mean that there is no meaning. I love the paradoxes of Buddhism. D.T. Suzuki shares this idea in regards to the story of Amida Buddha as an example of meaningless meaning and what that means. And the emphasis is that there's no goal per se. There's not a destination. It's the journey, the process. It's the beingness itself. Quote, when it comes to Amida Buddha, there was no purposeful intention on the part of Amida when he made his vows to bring all beings to awakening. Everything expressed in the vows was simply an spontaneous outflow of great compassion, of a great compassionate heart, embracing everything boundlessly. Again, in the words of Guillaume Cabose Sensei, quote, water flows effortlessly. It cannot help but flow. That is the way it is. Effortless effort, purposeless purpose. That is the real way of life. Although nothing can be accomplished without effort, the Buddha way is effortless effort, end quote. This is what we're referring to every Sunday when we say as a community in our opening meditation, nowhere to go, nothing to do, and no one to be. This reminds me of the Chinese wu wei, and what it translates into is action without action, effortless doing. And I've heard that the Enzo in Zen, the circle, is the representation of wu wei. Now, our brains can begin to hurt with such paradoxes, but what we want to do is we want to get out of our heads and get into our hearts, get into our experience. Again, this isn't as foreign as it may sound. How many of you love music? So what is the purpose? What's the utilitarian purpose of music? I would challenge you that music is the best example of what we're talking about when we say purposeless purpose. All music is ultimately purposeless, and all dance. When you dance, do you aim to arrive at a place on the floor? Or is the idea of dancing the dancing? No, the aim of dancing is simply to dance. Now, I don't know how many of you know of John Cage. John Cage was a 20th century postmodern music composer who was also very steeped in Buddhism. And this is what he says music is about. Quote, what is the purpose of writing music? One is, of course, not dealing with purposes, but dealing with sounds. Or the answer must take the form of a paradox. The purposeful purposelessness or a purposeless play. This play, however, is an affirmation of life, not an attempt to bring order out of chaos nor suggest improvements in creation, but simply a way of waking up to the very life we are living, which is so excellent once one gets one's mind and one's desires out of the way and lets it act of its own accord. End quote. I love this line from this. waking up to the very life we are living, which is so excellent once one gets one's mind and one's desire out of the way and lets it act of its own accord. Meaningless meaning makes intuitive sense to me. It is a way to free meaning from the conceptual and move it into the experiential. The experienced is valued over the conceived in the teachings of the Buddha. Concepts are dead. Only life is alive. The value is not in the end, and the meaning I impose on something does not give it value. The value is intrinsic in the randomness at the heart of our experience. Because random, accidental, relative doesn't mean without value or that it does not have meaning. The randomness of my coming into existence is very meaningful to me and my family. Your randomness of coming into existence has made my life more engaged, present, and meaningful. Randomness, if anything, is in its very randomness, makes everything and everyone even more incredibly unique and unrepeatable. Maybe we fear the randomness of life because we have so little control over it. Maybe we feel victimized by it. And yet our very existence itself is all the value we need. No measure or storied purpose is needed. Reading Uchiyami Roshi years ago, it was these lines that first captured me to his teaching and to the Buddha way. Quote, "When I took my first breath, my world was born with me. When I die, my world dies with me. In other words, I wasn't born into a world that was already here before me. I do not live simply as one individual among millions of other individuals. And I do not leave everything behind to live on after me. People go through life thinking of themselves as members of a group or society. However, this isn't how we really live. Actually, I bring my own world into existence, live it out, and take it with me when I die." End quote. He goes on to say that this beingness is our practice, and that whatever we are encountering right now is our life, is our practice, or as we would say, is Namo Amida Butsu, just as it is. And here is an important teaching Uchiyami Roshi and the spirit of the Nembutsu, or come as you are, that when we can let go of all our notions about things, about the purpose and meaning of things, that's when the truth of things can reveal themselves to us. I'd like to close in the words of Guillaume Cabose Sensei, where he says, quote, "True life is purposeless. To realize this truth is life. To realize this truth of life is Buddhism. In one sense, that purpose is, in another sense, it is purposelessness. Life is always like that, inclusive. True reality is natural and purposeless. Why not enjoy the naturalness of life? The doing itself is the end fulfillment. In this state, everything is at ease. This is the state of meaningless meaning. It has no meaning, and yet, in another sense, it has tremendous meaning. It is life itself." End quote. So let us let go of all of our opinions, preconceptions, stories, and embrace randomness, accident, relativity, meaningless meaning. These things do not make us victims. Meaningless meaning and purposeless purpose is not nihilistic. but does call for responsibility, the ability to respond to whatever comes our way, our practice allows us to cultivate acceptance. And in our acceptance, we cultivate our ability to improvise. Life is more like music and dance than some formulae. Dance and music are not about getting to the end, but about the journey. Let us listen for the call of all the Buddhas to come and dance. May we all embrace meaningless meaning, the purposeless purpose, the effortless effort, and the logic of the illogical. May everything we encounter be seen as your life and your practice. May it be so.